Hey YouTube, I wanted to make a video talking about the process I use to paint with alcohol inks. So in the beginning of the video, you're going to see me just sort of like messing around and moving the paint around, and this is just so beginners who don't know much about alcohol ink can they can get an introduction to the materials and kind of see how it behaves. My experience, if you want a wide variety of colors, you're going to want to use Ranger alcohol inks, and there is this other brand called Pinata, which is going to be cheaper, and you can buy the inks in bulk, which is kind of nice, but I've noticed the colors are quite vivid and they stain a little bit more, whereas the Ranger ones are a little bit more flexible. Additionally, I'm also going to show you the difference between dropping directly on the painting with the colors, which is how I used to paint with this, and that's how I think a lot of people who are new to it paint, but I'm also going to show you the benefits of, you can see the difference between when I just drop the inks directly on the paper with the apple in the bottom of the right of the paper. That's like a test apple. You just don't get enough control as when you do drop your paint directly into wells and then pull from there. About using really nice brushes. The paper's expensive enough, so using like simple synthetic brushes like the multi-packs you would buy for like newer artists, those actually work totally fine as long as they're like pretty smooth synthetic bristles, right? Like I'm using like I can't remember what brand this is, but it was like a $5 brush. So I usually just get a variety of shapes and sizes, right? Like you'll want a small liner for details, and you'll want like you want a big one for larger portions. I use a fan brush for like the fun details at the end, so it's good to experiment around with brushes, but I would also advise you not to use any of your nice watercolor brushes. Like have a designated set just for alcohol inks. And lastly, you just need some isopropyl alcohol. That's basically rubbing alcohol. You can get it at any store like Walmart or Target. It's pretty cheap. It comes in different concentrations from like, I believe 70% to 90%. And the concentration will affect how much it moves around the pigment. So I'm using 90% in this video, but feel free to play around and see what different effects you can get. So you can see I've started working here, just dropping directly onto the paper in the little test apple in the bottom corner. And it's like, when you're dropping that much paint onto something, you have a lot less control over it. A lot of alcohol ink is about like how much pigment is actually there versus how much alcohol is there. And so basically in my little palette thing, I have different amounts of alcohol ink in a well, and it'll basically evaporate after it's been on the well for a bit. And once it evaporates, it can be controlled a little bit more. So basically what you do when you drop it directly on the paper is you get a lot of the cool, like trippy effects you're seeing here, but you're not getting any of the control. Alright, so starting with painting this apple, basically I start light to dark. There isn't like a set rule where you can't go dark to light as well, but for me, it's easy to go too dark too quickly, and then basically you're not able to return to the lightest color. And the only way this is going to look realistic is if your values for your lights and your darks are realistic and believable. It's good to work from reference in the beginning. Obviously, if you're drawing like something from your imagination, you don't have to use reference. But I think while you're learning how this paint behaves, it's good to do studies of things that exist in the natural world. It's pretty cheesy to do an apple to start with. That's like the most like quintessential like 101 artist thing to do. But honestly, I like all the color variations in this picture I'm working from too, and it's just complicated enough to show little variations in the color while still using this paint that I thought it was a worthwhile thing. Additionally, so you see, basically I'm working from the wells, I drop the paint in there right away, and then I either allow them to dry a little bit so it evaporates, or I add a more diluted one, and that'll be the kind that expands a little bit more. A lot of alcohol ink painting is just knowing how much the ink is going to expand and knowing what colors to mix, right? Like I have this, I basically have a set number of inks, and I will mix like this red and this brown color together to make a darker version of red, because it's like they're not going to have the exact colors you need when you go to the store. You have to mix them yourself. That's another benefit of having all these wells. See, adding in the shadows, blah, blah, blah. tricky part about this stage is just making sure you don't go over the lines. Basically, no matter, even if you use very little rubbing alcohol, it's still going to expand a bit, unless it's pretty much just completely dry. You'll see sometimes where it's like if you're putting down ink and it's very dry in the well, then it doesn't expand very much at all, and that's more likely to create this little goo on the sides that you're seeing, right? The little black lines. But that is what causes it to be a little more controlled. So it's like balancing like a more diluted and a more concentrated version of it. And then with some more of that vibrant red, I think this is either poppy field or watermelon. One thing I want to point out too, you can mostly see it with that red to the side of this, right? Like certain colors will never return back to white. Certain colors like this red will stain pink. There's certain browns that'll stain green, and there's certain blues that'll stain pink. And so nothing is like completely removable, right? Like it'll usually stain a color. Some of them are better at lifting away than others. Like here, I'm trying to lift away the red to reveal a light pink. But you can't really go back to white. So that's why it's important, I feel like, to be conscious of not going too dark too fast. Additionally, that's part of the fun of alcohol ink is you do have these weird like two-toned colors that appear. Like you'll be putting down like a brown and then you'll lift it up and there'll be blue underneath, and it's like you may not have thought of including a color like that in the painting, but sometimes it turns out really cool, right? You're basically like you're leaning into the randomness of it rather than trying to control it 100%. And I feel like that's why people get frustrated with alcohol inks and painting representationally with them is you don't really get 100% to decide what it's going to look like. But that's like the cool thing about it, you know? It's like if you want something that you can control and fuss around, you can paint with oils, you know? But this is an entirely different thing. You want it to look kind of whimsical and cool, well then it's not going to be completely up to you how it turns out, and you got to be okay with that. I have noticed too, working with alcohol inks, these things, the paintings tend to go through an ugly phase before you're done, where you'll be working on it, and if it's not done yet, a lot of the times you'll just be like, God, this kind of looks not great, right? And it's just because it's like you got to get all the info down before you make a judgment on it. So try not to give up on your painting if you're not like totally stoked on it yet, you know? Moving on to leaves. There's like some weird colors in these leaves. Like we got to have a light blue, and I only have one shade of blue right now. So it's a lot of mixing colors. Try not to be too precious about keeping everything completely tight and within the lines, because as you can see, it's going to venture out on its own. Additionally, we are going to add a background a little bit later, just like a darker color to make it pop. And that's going to creep over the lines too, so not getting too finicky about it. Like try not to be a perfectionist with it. Just put the color down, make a decision, and move on. See, here's an example of when the ink is so like evaporated, like there's no alcohol in it, it basically just functions like a straight line like you just saw. Then what you do to move that around is just add a little bit more alcohol, but beware because it does expand like this. But there's a way to get like really good concentrated darks. It's just letting that, dropping some ink in the well and then letting it evaporate a little bit. Here we go again. Then we're gonna make some more expanding areas with a little bit more alcohol. Yeah, like that. Yeah, that's good. It's weird too. It's like the gooey ridge that you see on the edge of that leaf that's darker basically kind of functions as a barrier, and it can be lifted from with more alcohol too. So sometimes if I do go too dark and there's that kind of gooey looking barrier, I will just reactivate it with alcohol and bring it out further, and that'll give it a more seamless appearance. It's frustrating. See, now the red and the green are merging, and I didn't want them to. Sometimes that happens. Basically, I'm going to go back over it. You can see the paper underneath it is stained blue. But that's okay, because it's kind of blue there anyway. Going back in with a little bit of red to fix it. Hopefully it doesn't expand too far. Another thing I want to point out is if your thing is expanding more than you wanted it to, right? Like let's say you have an edge and you need it to stop before it hits something essential like an eyeball or like this leaf right here, you can actually blow on it to cause the alcohol to evaporate in place, and it usually stops it. You don't see me doing it in this video much because I didn't want to stick my head under the camera to just give everybody a headache, right? The branch. This part's fun. It's like you can start messing around and just playing with like shapes and lines, adding texture at this point, because the bulk of the apple's done. And that's the thing, it's like once you've done the challenging portions of the painting, like if you're working on a person's face, then the rest of it can be a little bit more like loose and trippy, and you can kind of just play around with the inks more. As long as you have like that foundational thing under it holding the image together, it's gonna look cool. Just pointing out we got that little edge there. To make it look a little more cohesive, we're gonna add a darker color in the back. So when I've done pet portraits in the past, where just like I paint people's dogs and stuff, I will usually add in a darker background. This helps me kind of get that tighter edge that I wanted, you know, and make sure things that went outside of the lines look a little more in their place. And this part's pretty fun too, because it doesn't really matter what you're doing, like as far as brushstrokes wise. Like it will make a little bit of an impact, but you're going for like a kind of weird, bubbly, random look, you know? You can play around with adding more colors too. I think this is the part that's like, people want to skip right to this without having to do the harder, tighter portions in the beginning. And it's like, I think you can obviously like, you should paint however you want, however you enjoy it. But I think having something tighter to look at in the painting and then having abstract elements is a little more interesting than just going right into abstract shit right away. This is kind of fun. This is that fan brush I was talking about. Integrating some pinks, some bubbly looking textures. This is when alcohol ink is really fun. Just playing around with it. Well, awesome. Well, I hope you guys like this video. Like and comment if you have any suggestions or any other questions that you have on using this medium. I do want to do another video all about materials at one point.